downtown and in the area in general. So seriously, thanks for showing up. We're probably going to wait another 5 minutes tops, maybe 10, and then we're going to just get this thing started. But thank you all for coming out.
Let's do it in 5.
Do it in 5?
I want to have a good conversation.
Perfect.
There's
right.
a whole bunch we can talk about, and we have a stream going on at the same time.
That's right.
So, this event will be recorded, and folks can watch it again afterwards for as long as they would like. So,
yep.
But thank you for being here in person.
Cool. Welcome, everyone, for coming out. My name is Reena, and on behalf of the AADL, we have a very special treat for you today. Lily Zheng is a no-nonsense diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker, strategist, and consultant who helps organizations and leaders achieve the DEI outcomes they need. Lily has come out to do a fireside chat with us about their latest book, DEI Deconstructed. It is a short book that details the history of the DEI industry and methods, and it takes apart what doesn't work and constructs a framework for what might. I could tell you all about it, but since we have our expert here, I think it would be better served to talk with them directly. Hey, Lily, welcome to the AADL.
Hey, it's great to be here. I am really excited to be having this conversation today, not just about the book, by the way, which is currently out in the lobby. You passed it walking in. And by the way, the copies there are not only going to be signed in a little bit after this conversation, but also free. So
That's
please
right.
pick up a book if you haven't already, and that will be coming up right after this. But my goal today is really to have a conversation about what works for creating inclusive communities.
Yep.
And when we think of communities, right, like I don't just mean like corporations or organizations. I mean like any group of people that are trying to come together, you know, whether that's a game night, whether that's a volunteer effort, whether that's just a group of friends. There's a lot we can learn from in terms of the history of this space that we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, that can teach us all, you know, what we can do better on in our own lives going through this sort of work. So we're going to have a really fun free-form conversation today. We have a couple questions prepared, but as is always the case, I really like Q&A. And so I want all of you here to be driving this conversation. So, we'll
right.
be talking for like, what, 30 minutes or so?
Yeah, so the format of this is going to be, we're going to chat with our questions for about half an hour, 40 minutes maybe, and then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session, so folks who are in the audience can come up and ask some questions, and then the next half hour after that will be the book signing and, talk back afterwards. Yeah, on a personal level, I want to sort of highlight the things that Lily said about local community space. I am very much somebody who is, I'm a townie. I've lived in Ann Arbor my whole life. I know that Ann Arbor has these deep roots in activism and pushing for progressive values, and it was one of the reasons why I tapped Lily to come out here today. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. There's so much activist history, I think, that we don't think of when we think of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because oftentimes it's a very corporate term. I'll be very frank, most of my clients are corporate clients. You see this stuff in terms of like, we want to make sure we hire more women and people of color on our corporate board of directors, blah, blah, blah. So there's this perspective that like, it's so far removed from the everyday experience of like, relationship building and like making space for folks. But really the things are one and the same, right? So that's what I want to have a conversation about, how we can use the history of what's happened and the present of everything happening in our country, around the world, that relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion to do better in our own lives and to take into stock some of these learnings.
Sure. With that being said, the first question that I have actually has to do with the work that you do specifically, which is most of the people that I know. So when I think about DEI, and when a lot of people in my communities think of DEI, it usually is diversity initiatives from corporations, from businesses. And a lot of them have this, they're pretty infamous for being awkward, contentious, most often ineffective, right? So like a lot of people, just have a really poor experience with these pushes. And I wanted to get your take on why that might be.
Yeah, well, who here in the audience has ever been to a mandatory training of some kind that just was awful and not particularly engaging or fun or educational or helpful in any way? Yeah, okay, so pretty much everyone here, right? That's the reputation. Oh God, I wish it wasn't the reputation of DEI work, but that's often how it manifests in practice. And one of the questions that I sought to answer when writing this book is how did it get so bad, right? Because the history, I mentioned the history a lot. We've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work since before it was called that, right? Since when it was started on the back of the civil rights movement in the 1960s to encourage companies to no longer discriminate against people of color and so on and so forth. We have a rich history of workshops, of hard conversations, of policies, and yet here we are today, right? And most people's direct association with all of these things is, what a waste of time. It's exhausting. It doesn't work. Now, what I found when I dug into the research, because this entire book was founded on tons and tons of research. I dug into thousands of documents going back, to the 60s, essentially saying, how did this field evolve? What worked? What didn't? What did the folks who came before us try, and how did they get things right or not? And what I found is that throughout that experience, we've had decades and decades of DEI work that was organized around intentions, right? Essentially saying, we're going to do this work because we think that we're good people, and if we're good people, whatever we try has to work, right? We're not going to measure outcomes. We're not going to measure anything, really. We're not going to hold ourselves accountable. In fact, one of the most interesting stories from the book was talking about, of all places, the U.S. Department of Defense, which is not the first thing I think of when I think of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it turns out, historically, they were one of the biggest employers that funded one of the biggest diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives of all time. They trained thousands of internal DEI practitioners. They spent millions of dollars on a project to diversify their ranks. And what ended up happening? Did they train thousands of practitioners? Yes. Did they train them well? Yes. They actually gave them hundreds of hours of training each, more than you would see in any certification program that exists This was in the 70s and 80s, right? It was, by most measures, we would say that that was an incredible initiative. And not only did it fail, it backfired so spectacularly that it actually worsened diversity, it worsened inclusion, and it worsened equity. So why, right? Why did something so expensive that took so much effort to do so many good things, that had lots of good people, fail so dramatically? Well, because, one, they didn't try to measure anything. In fact, the program that designed this initiative was expressly forbidden from measuring any outcomes. That was one of their instructions. Two, the leaders who got involved saw these DEI practitioners as a threat. They said, well, our authority is being undermined, so we're going to sideline you, we're going to make sure that we don't give you resources, we don't give you power, right? These trainings are really disruptive. And then the trainings themselves, they were founded on, really positive principles of like, well, let's come together, let's talk about these hard things. But in reality, the actual approaches that were used didn't actually meet people where they were at. They felt very blame and shamey. That was one of the primary techniques of the time. It sought to make people feel bad for their role in racism and sexism, etc., without actually giving them any way to feel better about themselves afterwards or focus on inclusive behavior after that. And as a result of all these things, right, this initiative, and it's a long story, I could sit here for 30 minutes telling the entire rest of the story, but long story short, it didn't work, right? For a number of reasons. It wasn't accountable. The leaders who had power weren't involved in a way that allowed them to leverage that power. They felt threatened instead. And finally, it made almost everyone involved feel really bad about themselves. And if we know anything from social psychology, it's that when we feel bad about ourselves, we don't change our behavior, right? Like if I started this conversation by saying, hey, all of you today, I really want you to change your behavior after this. Also, you're all awful people. I don't think you would change, right? I don't think you would enjoy this conversation. You'd probably get up and leave, right? And yet, that is the history, right, of this field, right? Like there's so much to go on in terms of how the practitioners who have come before us have failed. And the challenge, right, is huge when it comes to actually creating inclusive communities, when it comes to designing fair and equitable policies, when it comes to making organizations and environments where everyone in them, for all of our unique differences and identities, can thrive. It's tough work, right? Anyone who spent any time in a diverse community knows that it's not a walk in the park, right? So it's incumbent that we figured out how to get it right. That's what I want to keep talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like off of what you were saying in terms of like measuring outcomes and things. Part of your book actually said that affirmative action was one of the very few initiatives that took place in history that actually promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion in various spaces.
And succeeded. There's a lot of efforts that have promoted DEI, but very few in the history of the DEI industry that succeeded in meaningfully changing the representation of women, of people of color, et cetera, right? There's incredible research. So in the years after affirmative action was struck down, we saw the proportion of Black students in particular, and also women students, decline, right, all around the country, back to their levels before affirmative action was instituted. And by the way, not to focus overly on affirmative action, but it's been decades since affirmative action was struck down. And representation numbers haven't been anywhere close to where they were. Why? A whole bunch of reasons. But among others, affirmative action was one of the few policies that focused on outcomes over all else. It was like, I don't care how you do it. I don't care, how good or bad of a person you are. We are not going to stop until we achieve this outcome. Now we call them quotas, and it's kind of a dirty word, right? People bristle when they hear the word quota, but a quota is an outcome. And now, we don't say that. We're not allowed to say quotas. We're not allowed to say affirmative action. Instead, we say, we consider race, and we will try really hard to be equitable and inclusive, right? Intentions, great, love that. Everyone here has good intentions. I have good intentions, and it's not the same in terms of accountability, and we see that reflected in the data. Now, am I saying that affirmative action or bust, we got to go back to that? If I was writing policy, maybe, perhaps. But it is 2023. We need new solutions. But what we should learn is that unless unless we focus on those outcomes over all else, right? No amount of rhetoric, no amount of like nice speeches, no amount of good intentions can replace an outcome-focused approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that actually leads into the next question that I was going to ask, which was that.
Testing, testing. And now I'm mic'd up again.
Hooray! Now people on the live stream can hear you better. Cool. So that actually was going to lead into my next question, which was sort of from my perspective as a non-binary, non-white trans femme, and I'm sure you might feel the same. There's definitely this divide between representation and actual meaningful change, right? I feel like there are a lot of, I see myself a little bit more in movies and TV, like various parts of my identity and who I am. But in many spaces, people like me really don't get material parity, right? Equity is not coming forth in the same way, and I was curious to know what's up with that dissonance. What's going on?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of folks can report. So what we're seeing in the 2020s is that the pressure that's been put on many organizations following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 has actually meaningfully increased diversity in many organizations. It's also meaningfully increased the visibility of marginalized groups' experiences. So, especially if you're like a PR team or a marketing team, right? The thing on everyone's mind is, oh God, we need to get more people of color, we need more queer and trans folks, like we need to get folks in all of the advertisements and the brochures and whatnot. But as many people know, just appearing on a brochure or appearing in an ad or appearing in a movie is not the same as achieving equity in society or having the resources and support you need to thrive. And what we're seeing, at least in the corporate space and in higher ed and in nonprofits, so in lots of places, is that the increased representation of women and people of color and low-income folks and queer and trans folks and Muslim folks and Jewish folks tends to be happening at the most junior levels. Almost always, right? For a number of reasons. One, these are the roles that are open more often. There's often very little leadership turnover for higher prestige, higher power roles. When there is turnover, those people are typically selected from the inside or selected from prior contacts rather than through a formal hiring process. It's a lot to say there. But essentially, the outcome of all of this is that folks from multiple marginalized communities see themselves only represented in a very junior way. And they don't see themselves represented in terms of senior roles. And importantly, this entire conversation has only been about representation so far. I say that because most organizations are only focused on representation. That's the only outcome they particularly care about, right? So there's been a big initiative, right? We need to see more people like me in places like this. But I would argue that even if we achieve full parity, right? We see like roughly 50% of women in every single role. We see parity in terms of racial representation by every single level. It doesn't mean anything if they don't have the same amount of power. It doesn't mean anything if they don't get the same amount of pay. It doesn't mean anything if they don't get the same amount of respect or belonging or inclusion. But these outcomes, right? I mentioned outcomes earlier. They're not being measured. And so if we don't measure these things, we don't demand these things, then we all end up in the situation where we say, well, hold up. We've been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity, equity. It's been years, right? And yet when we look and when we feel, things haven't changed. And that feeds into this overall, I'll call it pessimism at best and cynicism at worst, with why do we keep saying the same things but feel like we're not making progress, right? And it's because we're not focusing, first of all, we're not focusing on outcomes. And when we do, it's only on the very shallow outcome of representation, which is not the end-all be-all, right? There was a recent piece that I wrote in the Harvard Business Review that essentially said, okay, representation, that's important. People have been asking for that since the 60s. In fact, it's legally required for most companies to share their representation numbers with the US government. And there's about 30 other outcome metrics that matter in the DEI space that most organizations just don't measure, don't collect, don't ask about at all. Belonging, thriving, access to opportunity, access to decision-making, participatory decision-making, let's see, respect, inclusion, psychological safety. Like, I can literally keep on going, right? All of these things are so, so, so important. But if we're not measuring them, if we're not talking about them, if we're not demanding them, then we'll never see them and we'll never feel them, and we'll be right back where we started.
I was going to move on to the next question, but actually, very briefly, you mentioned the words belonging and inclusion, and I'm really curious to know what you mean when you say that those are things that you can measure. And like, I mean, I understand, like, you know, pay equity is a big thing, but you know, how do you even measure somebody feeling like they belong? Like, that seems like a pretty difficult thing to quantify.
You're right. Sorry, you're right. You know, it's really interesting where we currently are, because the University of Michigan actually pioneered some super interesting ways to measure both inclusion and belonging. And I highly recommend that folks look into some of their programs, especially their intergroup communications program. It's very, very interesting. Now, I will say many measurements exist. One of the easiest ones that I use is a survey measure that says, I feel respected at work. Right, it's very simple.
Okay.
I feel like I can bring the parts of me that matter to work. I feel like I can talk about the identities that are important to me and have space made for me at work. I feel like I can talk about my race, my gender at work. I feel like my colleagues will support me if an incident happens. I feel like I will not be discriminated against at work, or I am not discriminated against at work. These are all ways we can capture this higher level factor of inclusion or belonging. And so you can essentially say, if people feel respected, if they can bring the parts of themselves that matter to work, if they're not getting discriminated against, or if when things happen, they feel supported by their colleagues and their bosses and their friends, if they have community, if they can, you know, connect with the things that are happening, you know, in our news cycle openly in their environments, if they're able to be authentic in terms of like what they want to bring into an environment. All of these are markers that they feel included. All of these are markers that they feel like they belong, right? And by the way, I will say that was kind of a nebulous answer, but I will also say that everyone knows when you don't feel like you belong. Right? Everyone here has been in a community, in a space, in an environment, in a setting where you couldn't really put a finger on it. You couldn't design a survey question if I called you on it to measure it, but you know for a fact that you didn't belong. Right? So we all deeply know that feeling. All of us know that feeling. And the task of reversing that, right, has been a really elusive one for social scientists and people who design, you know, survey metrics and whatnot.
Right.
But those are some, right?
Sure.
The list that I gave are some that we can get to in terms of defining inclusion and importantly, measuring the outcomes of inclusion and belonging.
That's really cool. I'm definitely looking to dig into some of that research myself at some point. So thank you for that answer. All right, so let's see. I have a question about your book. Spends some amount of time discussing how everyone has a place in helping advance equity for all, from the most marginalized to the most privileged. What advice do you have to giving agency to people from different types of backgrounds? Like, say, you know, there's me, right? Somebody who is non-white, somebody who's trans. I have maybe a different kind of influence on a workplace than somebody who is white, somebody who is cis. What does that look like? Like, how does that work in your head?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question about power, right? So this is a question about how we use power, how we leverage identity as power, how we leverage what researchers call positionality, right? The identities we occupy, and then also not only that, but the sort of social spaces we occupy and our situational access to power in those spaces. So, for example, our identities, right, come with certain privileges and marginalizations. Every single person has a unique mix of privilege and marginalization by dint of not only, things like your race, your gender, your sexuality, or your class, but also lots of other markers like your parental status, your immigration status, your veteran status, where you went to school, where you grew up, your accent, all sorts of things, right? There's more than I can name. And what we should take away from that is our unique blend of identities and experiences gives us unique access to certain spaces, to certain communication styles, to certain networks, so on and so forth. That boils down to every one of you in this room can do a thing or can access a space or can speak to a community in a way that no one in this room can do as well as you. Every single person in this room can do that. Now, I don't know exactly what it is for each person. I suspect that each of you, if you thought about it for a little bit, could figure it out, right? Thinking, if there was a space that I'm an expert in because of who I am, because of my experiences, because of my identities, what would it be? Right? I bet you all have something like that. Now, learning how we can leverage our power and our identities to access those spaces, to leverage those resources, to make change in the way that only we can. That is what it means to use our power, right? And it's not just a matter of like, if you have X privileges here, you can do these things, and if you have Y marginalizations, you can't. It's more complicated than that, right? Because intersectionality dictates that all of our identities combine at once, and it's a huge, messy smorgasbord of access and power and whatnot. It's fascinating stuff. But the lesson here is that none of us are ever truly powerless, ever, right? None of us are ever truly powerless. We will always have situations where we have more or less power, more or less access, more or less resources, more or less influence, more or less community networks, so on and so forth. But we never have nothing in every situation. That's simply not true. So if we can find the zone or the place or the style or whatever that allows us to leverage our power most to get to meet our agenda, right? Hopefully greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, is part of our agenda in some way, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So, please don't leverage your power for, greater homogeny, greater exclusion, and greater inequity, because then I will probably have to ask you to leave. But assuming we all want to build better communities, right, more inclusive communities, this is all power we can leverage, right? This is something we can all do. And you don't have to get a degree. You don't have to be a DEI practitioner. You don't have to go into corporate consulting, right? Anyone and everyone can do this now. You just have to find your own source of power.
I sort of wanted to follow up that question with sort of the very obvious, there are some people who might not be interested or might not know that this is work that needs to get done. What can you do to actually get people to sort of not only understand that, but also understand what responsibilities they have to make that happen, right? And I think that while we're talking about all of these identities, we're also talking about, what position does somebody hold within a company? What is say a leader, right? What is their responsibility in all of this, right? And some would argue, especially if it's a top-down organized system, the leaders would have almost all of the responsibility to invoke a certain amount of the change, right?
Yeah, I'd agree with some of that. So there are two questions that I'm hearing here. One is, what is the responsibility of a leader of a community to be taking on this task, right? So I'll focus on that first. If you are a leader of a community, which, by the way, I want you to interpret very broadly, because you don't have to have a C-suite title to be a leader. You don't have to be a manager to be a leader. If people rely on you to do something, you are a leader in some way, right? The responsibilities of leaders are absolutely to drive this sort of work, to set the example, to lead by example, and to leverage their power to create change. Something that I write in the book is everyone is responsible for creating the change that they have power over, right? So for example, if you're not running a Fortune 500 company, it's not your responsibility to figure out how a Fortune 500 company runs. No, that's not for you to do. If you do occupy that position, then that is your responsibility. And so it's this idea of duty, right? This idea that our own positionality gives us a set of unique responsibilities in addition to our unique set of, access to power and whatnot. So just ask yourself that exact same question. What unique responsibilities do you have? What unique opportunities do you have to leverage your identities, to leverage your voice, to create change? And when I say responsibility, I'm not saying that if you don't do it, you get in trouble, right? Like I am certainly not going to like Big Brother watch over your shoulder and be like, ooh, you didn't do that thing you're responsible for, right? Like you're a bad activist. But call it like personal responsibility. Because if we want to feel agentic in this work, if we want to feel effective in this work, then we do need to take some personal responsibility. And I know for a fact that most people I talk to about personal responsibility when it comes to feeling included get overwhelmed because there's literally an infinite amount of things to do in this world.
I was about to say, it's really easy to, especially from somebody who's in a marginalized position, to feel as though there are so many things that have to get done and to feel like, you don't have enough power to be able to take on those responsibilities.
Correct. Which is why, I don't personally have a perfect answer for this, but my answer, my working answer comes in two parts. One, you need to recognize that you quite literally cannot do this work on your own. Nobody can do this work on your own, right? There's a certain amount, there is a limit to all of our access to power. There's a limit to all of our hard work, right? No matter how much we push ourselves, no matter how much we burn out, there are no like single heroes in this space. You just can't do it. Now, the second part of that, because that one realization is frankly very depressing. I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel good about myself. I'm like, great, there's a limit. Okay, well now the world's still burning, right? And I'm tired. So the second part of that is collective liberation is how we get this work done, right? Like we require community. It is not optional, right? Where our personal efforts end, the community has to begin, right? Like, if we can work together in groups of people, in organized communities that all do different things, that all address different issues, that all tackle the problem from different angles, that's how we sustain our effort. So I usually have these conversations within organizations, within nonprofits, higher ed, corporations. It's almost always the same thing. There's almost always some really passionate people. They go to all the events. They're really enthusiastic. They come out, they talk about DEI all the time, and they're drained. They're so tired. They're saying like, well, I went to like 20 events in the last year, and like everything's still on fire. I hate myself. Like, I wish I could fix it all, right? Like, I think we all know one person in our lives that wishes they could like fix it all, right? And gets personally offended when they don't. And maybe that's us. Personally, I'm slightly guilty of that, right? I definitely have had that thought several times. And the answer is not do more or get better, because there's a limit to that too. It's find community. It's find folks who you trust so much that you can take breaks and just stop for a day, for a week, for a month, and you can feel like the work is still continuing. Find folks that you can ask for help. Find folks who do the work just as well as, if not better than you in a different way. And then keep on finding them until you are in community. You lean on community, you rely on community to the extent that you feel like as a group, each one of you as individuals has permission to take a break and stop, and the overall effort will still succeed. Right? Like that's what it takes to do this work sustainably. That's also what it takes to not feel guilty for the world burning down, because we've put in our 8 hours a day of working hard and like still the problems aren't fixed. Like that's the state of the world that we live in. We can't fix it all ourselves. We have to fix it within community.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Sort of as a segue to that, actually, here at the AADL, like we're all about community. We're hoping to create, an inclusive community that makes space for everybody. And I was curious what lessons you might have to share from your work that might help with that.
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is something from disability justice and the history of disability movements, which is this idea called the curb cut effect. Now, who here has seen or used, I'm sure that's everyone, a sidewalk curb cut, the part where it slopes down to the street? Yeah, so here's a really interesting thing. They benefit so many people. They benefit joggers, they benefit people with strollers, they benefit delivery people, they benefit cyclists, a whole bunch of people. Were they designed with these very random groups in mind? No, they were designed for accessibility. They were designed by centering marginalized people, by saying this is absolutely required to make our society meet this minimum standard of accessibility. And as a result of designing for marginalized people, the benefits accrue to everybody, right? And this is the idea of the curb cut effect, which is also summarized in the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats, which is when you design for the most marginalized, the multiply marginalized, you meaningfully benefit everybody. And this is one of the primary principles of designing for any inclusive community. You can't just design, so approaches that don't work. You can't just design for the most privileged of your community and then one at a time go after different groups who might not be having the best experience and sort of sequentially try to make your community better for them. Because for those who are having the most challenges feeling included, the most accessibility concerns, they're at the bottom of the list, right? We can't do that. We also can't take this approach where we say, well, you know, this month we're going to be focusing on women, and this month we're going to be focusing on people of color, and we're going to do one event here and one event there. Because the other lesson is that marginalizations aren't these like separate little dominoes that are, you know, all different from each other. They all relate, they overlap. And the folks who are multiply marginalized experience all of these, you know, these experiences of exclusion, of inaccessibility at the same time. And so if we're trying to preserve our resources, our energy, our momentum in the movements that we build, we need to do things backwards. We need to do things the opposite way from how we normally do them. So instead of, let's do what's easy, and then slowly try to stack on progressively harder DEI-related like inclusion initiatives, do it the other way around. Start from the hardest possible thing. Start from centering the folks who have the worst experiences, who have, you know, the most inaccessible, the most exclusive experiences, and ask, what is fundamentally wrong or off or insufficient about the way our community currently is? Why does it not work for you? And then work backwards from there. Because if you design for those folks, right, and then you progressively, you know, take it easier and easier from there, you will build a community that actually works for everyone. Right? And that's not how most of us build communities, because let's be real, no one teaches us how to build communities. No one taught me how to build a community, right? Like you just go in and you do your best. And everyone I know builds a community for ourselves, right? Like when I build a community, I want to build a space that I want to have a good time in. Like that's very natural. We all do that. And we were just having this conversation about responsibility. If we are leaders within communities, we have the responsibility to look at it the opposite way. Instead of saying, how do I build for people who are in the room already, which is easy, ask, how do I build for people who aren't here? How do I build for the people who need to be here, right? That's the hard question to answer. But if we answer it, we figure this stuff out, right? Like that's at the heart of how we build inclusive communities. Also, I realized I hadn't been holding this mic up to my mouth and I wasn't amplified. I apologize for that.
No, don't worry. Thank you for that answer. And I think that's all the questions that I had. So fireside chat.
Let's open it up. Yeah. So we have a mic here in the center. So if you would like to get up and share your question via the mic, and if you'd also like for someone to bring the mic to you, you're welcome to as well. Yeah. Go for it.
You go. You can just go up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you.
My question is, what is your thoughts of diversity, equity, and inclusion for people with disabilities? Because I have autism with a learning disability, and I've been through education places, workplaces, communities, where they tell me that you don't belong because you have a disability.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely, everybody needs to be included in this world that we are building, right? And we need to be focusing our spaces, our conversations on people who are disabled, right? First of all, one, it needs to start with saying there's nothing wrong with saying the word disability. There's nothing wrong with saying the word autistic, right? And to build spaces that work for everybody, one of the other things we need to realize is we don't do one size fits all. We can't make one space with one set of offerings that works for every single person. We need to give everyone what they need, right? So specific support, specific resources, specific guidance, specific anything, right? And it starts with making the question of what do you need? The basic question here. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so just, you know, this question of what is it that you need, and not presuming that we know the answer. Because if we ask everybody, what do you need from this space? What do you need from this community? I don't know. I can't read everyone's mind. But if we ask people those questions of what they need, and we empower them to give, you know, their answer, and we are willing to use our resources and power to give everyone what they need, like that's how you design a community, right? And sometimes those needs are not things that you expect, right? And sometimes oftentimes those needs cost money. Oftentimes those needs require different commitments. And so this is part of the challenge, right? If we say we care about inclusion, we need to be willing to put our money where our mouth is. We need to be willing to do differently and to do more. Because if we're only willing to support a very small group of people who all look, act, and think the same, who have the exact same needs, then we can't say that we care about DEI, because these two things cannot coexist, right? We need to make space for everyone. That's what it looks like in practice, right? So thank you so much for asking that question.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, other questions?
Hello. So this is something that I struggle with often because I have a lot of colleagues who are Caucasian, and they have a difficult time with, one, why do we have to measure outcomes, right? Effectively, we're setting a quota. And then two, why do we even have this target? I feel like we should be trying to achieve DEI efforts in different ways. And to be honest, it just gets exhausting to try to always have to explain to them, because I think it's hard because it also comes from a place of empathy and trying to understand a different perspective. And I'm just curious how you would approach these kinds of conversations, because they not only happen with employees, but also with leaders that I work with as well.
I have those conversations all the time. That's literally my day job, having those conversations. They're exhausting, right? Because it's not just that, you know, they don't like the idea of targets. It's that it feels like there's something else fundamentally missing, right? It's like that phrase you said, right? It seems like an empathy challenge. Like, I definitely hear that. And by the way, it's hard to teach empathy.
Yeah,
right?
there's that one viral meme that's just like you can't tell people, I can't explain to you that you need to care for other people. Like, that's just like a tweet that people reference a lot.
Yeah. So I'll say this. I actually take a slightly different approach, because underlying all of that, in my experience working with leaders, and not just white leaders, right? Working with leaders who often have power that they're not willing to let go of, and that can be leaders of any identity, right? Is there's actually an underlying fear or an anxiety, which is this world that I see you as representing, you know, folks trying to create, is not a world that will be as good for me as this world that we're in now, right? It's this fear that the status quo that benefits me right now is much better than whatever you're talking about. So I don't like what you're talking about, but I can't say that. So instead, I'll just make it very slow for you, so that by the time you figure that out, it'll be like another 20, 30 years. I'll be fine. I have time. So my strategy is to not actually logically try to convince them that targets matter. I can make that argument. In fact, I made that argument at the beginning, right? Measure what matters, and unless we measure it, it's not going to succeed. You can actually say that an infinite number of times, and leaders will still just not listen, because the logic was never the problem, right? It was the fundamental assumption around, like, well, I don't think we should be creating that world. And so I argue instead, I help people co-create with me, to co-imagine with me, a world that is not only better for all the marginalized groups who are not thriving in today's world, but somehow even potentially better for cisgender, heterosexual, rich white men as well. Which is kind of hard to imagine because, you know, it's pretty good right now, I would say. But I think, right, like part of our challenge is that if we want to include these leaders, we need to be able to like imagine a future that they actually feel good about as well. Their biggest fear, by the way, and I've heard this from a lot of leaders behind closed doors, is that somehow queer people, trans people, people of color, women, just want to invert the pyramid, right? Like that's their biggest fear. It's like, well, I know that the world right now is terrible and that the people on the bottom are having a really bad time, but I am fundamentally unable to imagine a world without power imbalances. So when you say you want things to be better, I'm only hearing you want things to be worse for me, right? And that makes anyone feel threatened. So the the strategy that I use, right, is to say, like, I hear you, this is your concern. I don't want a future where you are having as bad of a time as I'm having now. I want a future where all of us, including you, can be doing better, can be thriving even more, right? And this is something that I think appeals to a lot of folks. And, you know, no matter how many privileges you have, there's always a privilege that you don't have, that you wish you did, right? So sometimes I'll talk to a leader, right? I'll say like, okay, so I get it, like cisgender, heterosexual, white man, Joe, right? Things are really good for you, but it's really awful right now that the old boys club in your company seems to only benefit people who, I don't know, got their law degrees from Harvard. And I know you didn't get your law degree from Harvard, right? Like, it's just a real bummer, buddy, right? Like, you don't have every privilege in the world. And isn't it kind of unfair that because we lack a standardized hiring process or standardized promotion process that you can sort of check all those privilege boxes, but you're still not enough if your boss doesn't like you because you didn't go to Harvard? And you'll probably get a little bit of like, yeah, I wish I went to Harvard, right? and you can use that to be like, look, it's not just you who didn't go to Harvard who has a hard time with that, right? It's in fact like 99% of people that have a really hard time with that. And couldn't you imagine a world where things are actually fair? Where like you talk a lot about meritocracy, can you imagine like a real meritocracy? Where like if you do your hardest and you do good work, you get the promotion, you get the job. Wouldn't that be incredible? Even if you didn't go to Harvard, right? Like, and that's a conversation that I think a lot of folks are willing to have. It's just not one that they've like, they sort of say, well, I'm a cishet white man, so I can't have this diversity conversation, right? Because they're thinking too narrowly. So that's just a slight rhetorical reframe that I use. It doesn't work with everyone, right? But it's a different way to address the same challenge.
Brilliant, thank you.
I have a question that includes a comment. And in the broader sense, it's like, what do you do for your sources of encouragement? And as an example, I saw a video with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I admire very much. And he was talking to Ben Shapiro. You know who that is?
I saw the same video last week.
And I felt so good watching that video because Ben Shapiro, it comes on, he makes people think he's smart because he talks so fast. And he's so anti. I've never heard someone as like, well, he's, so anti. And Neil deGrasse Tyson just came from this calm place. I just couldn't imagine, because, this person is, he's really shooting a lot of hate. And he just said to him, the first time I ever saw Ben Shapiro shut up, it seems like he's not possible of it. And he said, and then he just said calmly to him, well, why does this matter to you? You don't want them to have rights, but why, it doesn't hurt you. Why are you, and I just thought, oh my God, if I could talk like that, and not lose my sense of equilibrium when somebody is being so hateful. So where's your source of strength and positivity in this when there's so much hurt that people are putting out?
That's a really good question. And I'll talk very briefly about that clip because I think there's something that most people aren't seeing in that clip, which is that Ben Shapiro actually respects right? There's a huge amount of respect there.
Unusually so.
Unusually so. He doesn't usually respect the people he talks to. And with that respect comes power, right? So we talked a little bit about power earlier. And I want to say here, there is no rhetorical trick that we can use that will make someone who fundamentally doesn't respect us suddenly respect us, right? Like, I can talk very slowly. I can talk with gravitas. I can talk calmly. And if the person I'm talking to doesn't respect me, it doesn't matter. And part of this conversation we need to ask ourselves is, am I the right person to be having this conversation with this other person? And sometimes the answer is no. So sometimes I will walk away from a conversation with someone, not because I don't feel like I can win, but because like I feel like I'm fundamentally not the right person to help them get to where they need to be. There's another person they need to talk to, right? So in the DEI space, we talk a lot about the role of, let's say, like white men practitioners. There's a big controversy actually over white men practitioners. There are some folks in the space that say like, well, it's an outrage for white men to be doing like DEI work, right? Like it should be for people of color and queer and trans folks only, and so on and so forth. Personally, I think we need people with privilege and power doing this sort of work, because there are people that they can talk to that I can't, right? Like some of my colleagues I respect in this space actually vote Republican. And they're good in this space because they can talk to people who would never, ever, ever in a billion years talk or look at me, right? Because they can take people who are just radically way over here and like move them there, right? Now, I'm like way over there, so they don't even listen to me, they don't look at me, they don't interact with me, but there is a huge power in being someone that is respected with a target audience, right? So for you, right, I'll say my advice is not like figure out rhetorically how you can talk to hateful folks. It's figure out who the folks are in your community that you have unique reach to that maybe other folks couldn't access, right? Maybe they're family members, maybe they're colleagues, maybe they're friends who trust you, who listen to you, who love you. And ask yourself how you can move them to where they need to be in a way that no one else can. And I believe, right, that you already have that ability, that like anyone else in this room, if they were trying to work with the same people, would find much more challenging because they're not you. And I think all of us have, those people in our lives, right? Like I certainly have people in my life who I love, who I care about deeply, right? Who I feel like I have a unique responsibility to move in a certain direction and to, help them become more inclusive, because if they won't listen to anyone, like they'll definitely listen to me. And that makes it my responsibility, right? So it's not everyone's job to confront Ben Shapiro. Though if you ever find yourself confronting Ben Shapiro, like power to you, like good luck.
I'll take off my mask for the mic. I appreciate your talk, but I wanted to know, I haven't read your book yet, but I wanted to know, because I've worked with different nonprofits, I've worked abroad, I've also been in higher education, and two key points that really struck with me that I'm glad you brought up was the issue of presuming and assumption, as well as the issue of representation, because I think there needs to be a differentiation between representing and people actually assuming that they can speak for the people that they decide to increase representation of. I've seen this especially not only in government offices, but more so, quite frankly, in nonprofits, local nonprofits. And I'm thinking of one in particular that I had I had several years of experience with, that I finally just said, and they're kind of respected for their talking aloud a lot about representation. But if you look at their staff, if you look at even the dialogues that they have, there's very little representation. And I was wondering if you addressed that in the book. And then the other issue of, you talk a lot about like government offices. Did you do any research in, and again, I'm speaking as somebody who hasn't read your book yet. Did you do any research in not only higher education, but even in education generally. The other night I was talking about, I've worked as a substitute teacher, and quite frankly, I'm very dismayed to see so many books being banned throughout the country in different schools. And friends and I were talking that things that we assumed we would learn in school, like if we're going to be studying World War II, we will definitely study the Holocaust. If we're going to be studying American history, even if there's only one page in this stupid history book, now I'm dating myself, this is back in the 80s, but yeah, so you do the math. So you only have one page on Native Americans or American Indians. And this was an AP book, right? Now, again, this was 86, 87. If we study American history generally, and the Civil War, are we going to be able to study slavery? Because so many places, they're not only banning books, they're banning whole subjects. So do you go into that in some of your, because I'm just really concerned about that, what will people be learning? See, when you have that absence, then when people go to college, for instance, and not everybody's going to college, and they learn later in life, if they didn't go to college, about the Holocaust or slavery or what happened to American Indians, they're like, well, that can't be true. We didn't learn that in school. Well, there's a reason you didn't learn that in school. So it makes the battle even harder, much more up, like a steeper climb.
Yeah, I totally hear you. So the second part of your question first, and by the way, thank you for asking both of those. They're great questions. I don't tackle K through 12 education primarily in this book. The focus on the book is mostly on organizations and how we can create, more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations. And the broader cultural zeitgeist you're talking about, right, where people are not only scared of certain topics, but they're actively trying to prevent younger generations from learning about them. It is all related. So I definitely want to affirm what you're saying and to say that it will get increasingly harder to have these sorts of hard conversations unless we're able to recognize that people's perceptions of reality or truth or history, right, are diverging to such an extreme degree in this country. And that's going to be a problem we have to solve if we want to, succeed in this work that we are doing. There's a lot of important work happening, right, in nonprofits around the country, working with media literacy and, helping to get kids access to these books, right? Library systems play a huge and really powerful role in combating misinformation and combating these initiatives, right, to hide history from especially students, who are hungry for knowledge. So I'll just say that. Now, with regards to your first question, absolutely. So I talk about tokenism and trust a lot. So tokenism is the state of an organization bringing on someone who looks like a member of that community, but doesn't represent them, doesn't speak for them, isn't trusted by them, right? And using them as a sort of bulwark against criticism. Right, essentially saying well, we can't be sexist, we have a woman on our board, or we can't be racist, we brought on a black VP, right? Or we can't be homophobic, this senior member is gay or lesbian, right? And it's a very common strategy. Unfortunately, I would say it's actually quite common within nonprofits, given the research that I've done there. And it's insidious, it's bad, right? It happens quite a bit. Now, something that I talk about in the book is that we can't treat representation as the end-all be-all, and that even some of our focus on representation might not quite be capturing what it is we want to see. Because I don't think we just want to see people who look like us. I think we want to see people who get us, people who understand our community's issues, people who can speak about things that matter to people like us. That's a slightly higher bar than they look like us, right? Or they happen to check the same box as we do. So, holding our leaders to this higher bar of not only do you have this identity, because look, if I was looking for a person who just checked a box of identity, I could find anyone, off the street who looked like that and be like, just do this thing and say this thing, right? And be my figurehead, be my token. But it's much harder to find someone who the community trusts, who the community respects, who's so in community with the community that they can speak for them, right? That's a higher bar. And if we want to have representation that matters, right, that's the bar we need to be holding our leaders to. And I'll say this, a slightly controversial thing. Because of how important it is that our leaders hold communities' trust, I actually don't think in every situation it's necessary for someone to check that box of having that identity to hold the trust of a community. I've actually seen a handful, not as many as I would have liked, but a handful of male leaders who really hold the trust of women because of just their track record of, fighting hard and advocating for them. I've seen a handful of white leaders hold the trust of people of color. I've seen a handful of cisgender heterosexual people hold the trust of queer and trans people. And so I think this higher bar of not just this arbitrary, like, what boxes do you check, but also, more importantly, are you trusted by the community? Can you speak for this community? Does the community, see you as a champion of them? Like, that's the standard we should be holding all of our leaders to, regardless of identity, right? Because there's also this challenge where for tokens, right, for people who are members of our community who occupy these leadership positions, it feels like they do have to be perfect. And we often never hold the other leaders accountable in like a tenth of the way we hold the women accountable, or the people of color accountable, or the queer trans people accountable, right? And I don't think that's particularly fair. I think we need to hold every single leader, right, regardless of their privileges or marginalizations, accountable to representing us, the community, right? And that's my thoughts on that topic. I do write about it in the book, so I encourage you to check it out. Speaking of that, I think we are roughly at time.
Yeah, we're pretty close to it. So if anybody has any quick questions, maybe we could do one
Any final
more.
questions?
Yeah.
You emphasize the need for privileged people to work in DEI, and I was wondering what you thought about how people can achieve that without, I guess, talking over marginalized people.
Love that question. I get that question a lot. Have you heard of racial caucusing? It is a common organizing tactic that essentially says you find your zone of most influence, not trying to find other communities you're not in to get into, but working instead with your own communities, right? So when I work with people with privileges, right, whether they're men, whether they're white folks, whether they're non-disabled, whether they are cisgender or heterosexual, the immediate urge is to say, okay, I see that like all those people of color or queer folks or disabled folks or whatever are like talking over there. I'm gonna go get in their conversation and like figure it out and like be a good ally, right? And that's literally like the worst possible thing to do. Like the distaste that people have on their face is just like, oh no, please, 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 like don't. And it's not that like we don't want allies, right? We don't want privileged folks entering our spaces. It's that just simply isn't the zone of most impact, right, for privileged people. So I talked like several times in this conversation, right, about it's not about taking action. It's about taking the right action. It's about taking action that only we can take. And the powerful thing about privilege is it gives you access to certain communities or certain spaces or resources that people without those same privileges could just never see in their lives. And so I tell folks, like, if you are white, work with other white folks. There's stuff that you can do and say that like no one else can. If you're a man, work with other men, right? If you are high class, work with other high class people. And it's deeply uncomfortable work because it often means you are going to be one of the few people who get it in a room full of people who don't, right? It's exhausting. And I get it. It's satisfying sometimes to go into a DEI related space and be like, oh, finally, like a whole bunch of people get it, right? And you should find community in those spaces, for sure, but that's not your zone of highest impact. So the way you can do DEI work without speaking over people of color or speaking over other people with marginalizations is to look for a space where they aren't speaking because they simply aren't present. That's how you avoid speaking over folks, right? If folks are speaking, that's a great sign that you don't need to be there because they've got it covered, right? Look for spaces where they're silent because you're not there, right? Because they don't have an advocate yet. They don't have someone who gets it. And if you get it, that's your space, right?
Cool.
Thanks, folks, for being here.
That was a really great question to end on. Thank you all for coming out here, and thank you so much, Lily, for doing this fireside chat and Q&A. Yeah.
My pleasure.
All right. We're going to be doing the book signings and the book giveaways in the back, and Yeah, I hope everybody has a good rest of their weekend.
And if you had any other questions you were burning to ask, please feel free to ask me in the front and grab a book. If you haven't already, I will be signing books.